The morning of October 15th, 1880, started quiet in Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory. 41 degrees above zero and a thin October sun, the kind of morning that makes a man look at his half-built claim shanty and think he still has time. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped 60 degrees, and snow fell for the next 6 months. When it was over, historians at the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society would rank the winter of 1880-81 as the most extreme on record at every major station on the northern plains, not the coldest single day, not the windiest week, but the most extreme sustained winter in recorded Dakota history, a 6-month siege that cut off every railroad supply line for up to 4.5 months, filled railroad cuts with 40-foot drifts, and forced settlers to grind wheat through coffee mills because no flour could get through. Most of the settlers in this story nearly starved inside their houses. One woman, 61 years old, 4 feet 10 inches tall, did not. Her name was Ingeborg Halse. She had arrived in Kingsbury County 8 months earlier from Voss, in western Norway, a place that gets 20 feet of snow in a good year and has been dealing with extreme winters since before the Viking Age. She had $4.80 in her coat pocket when she filed her homestead claim, no husband and no sons old enough to swing an axe. The nearest neighbour with a working frame house was a Norwegian immigrant named Gunnar Solversen, who had arrived the spring before with a fresh lumber order from the Burlington Railroad and the absolute conviction that anyone still building with dirt in 1880 was either ignorant or too poor to know better. Solversen was not wrong about the poverty part. What he was wrong about catastrophically, memorably wrong, was everything else. This is the story of what Ingeborg built, why she built it, and what the winter of 1880-81 did to prove her right in a way that nobody in Kingsbury County ever forgot. But before we get to any of that, we need to talk about a fact of physics that most people living in modern houses have never had to think about. If you dig a hole anywhere in the American Northern Plains, Dakota Territory, Minnesota, Nebraska, and dig it deep enough, 6 feet, 8 feet, 10, when you get to the bottom of that hole in the middle of January with 40 below zero up on the surface, the temperature of the earth surrounding you will be somewhere between 42 and 48 degrees Fahrenheit, not 55, as some books claim, and not 60. The confirmed range for Central Dakota Territory, verified by the North Dakota Geological Survey and the NDSU Geothermal Studies, is 42 to 48 degrees cold enough that you'd want a coat, warm enough that your water doesn't freeze, and warm enough that a small fire, one that burns a fraction of what a drafty frame cabin needs, can push that ambient temperature up to 60 or 65 degrees. That gap is everything. The difference between surviving a Dakota winter and not surviving one often came down to exactly that physics, not courage, not determination, not character. Heat moves from warm to cold, always and without exception, at a rate determined by the temperature difference between inside and outside. A frame cabin at 60 degrees on the inside versus minus 45 on the outside has to fight a temperature difference of 105 degrees. A half-buried earth house at the same interior temperature, with walls surrounded by 45-degree soil, fights a difference of only 15 degrees, which works out to roughly 7 times less heat loss, 7 times less firewood, and 7 times more margin for error when the railroad stops running and no more fuel is coming. Ingeborg Halse had not read any geothermal studies. There were none in 1880. But she had spent 61 years in Voss, Norway, where the oldest farmhouses had been built into hillsides for centuries, not because Norwegians were stubborn, but because Norwegians were cold, and they had learned what kept them alive. She arrived in April 1880 on the Chicago and Northwestern Railway at the new town of De Smet. She carried 1 trunk, 1 cast-iron pot, a hand axe, a grass-cutting scythe, and her late husband Eric's hand-drawn diagram of the hillside house they had lived in near Voss for 32 years. Eric had died of a chest illness the previous November. Their sons, Christopher and Magnus, had already gone ahead to Dakota Territory the year before and were running cattle near Huron, and they had sent her the train ticket. What they had not sent, and what she had not asked for, was a place to live. Christopher assumed she would stay with a Norwegian family in De Smet until arrangements could be made, and Magnus assumed Christopher had handled it. Ingeborg filed her homestead claim on April 19th, 1,880, on a quarter section of land southeast of De Smet that had a single distinguishing feature the land agent had called a liability: a steep creek bank running along the south edge, 6 feet high, nearly sheer, facing almost due south, with good clay soil. She paid the $14 filing fee with most of what she had, and that creek bank was why she chose the land. Gunnar Solverson saw her surveying it the following week and laughed the first time. He was a big man, 38, with a new lumber frame house going up on the flat ground, a quarter-mile north. He had ordered milled boards from the Chicago and Northwestern Freight Yard. He had a good iron stove and 2 cords of hardwood, with an additional order of coal coming in October. He had read the Territory Land Office pamphlets, and he had talked to the men at the general store in De Smet. What he saw Ingeborg doing, pacing the base of a dirt bank, poking at the clay with a stick, measuring the slope of the ground with her eyes, looked to him exactly like what it was: an old woman about to dig herself a hole. "You're going to live in the bank?" he called out in Norwegian. "I'm going to live in the hillside," she said. "Same as I did at home. This isn't Norway," he said. She didn't answer that. She went back to poking the clay. The quarter section Ingeborg filed on had grass that reached her hip in places, big bluestem and switchgrass, the kind that has been anchoring northern plains soil since the last glacier retreated. Underneath that grass was a root mat, so dense and interlocked that you needed a steel blade and a strong pull just to cut through it. Settlers called it prairie sod, with a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration, because the same root system that made farming it nearly impossible also made it the most available building material on the continent. Sod bricks do not rot quickly, they do not burn, they do not blow away. They weigh between 40 and 55 pounds each, and once stacked and settled, they stay where you put them. The creek bank she had chosen ran 6 feet high and nearly vertical, composed of the dense clay-loam subsoil that underlies most of Kingsbury County. She paced it at roughly 40 feet of usable length. The face of it looked due south, not within a few degrees, but almost exactly south, which she had verified by watching where the noon sun struck the ground, and that orientation was not an accident. She had picked it before she filed. By the first week of May, she had begun cutting sod. The sod of the Dakota Prairie, buffalo grass, bluestem, grama, bound by decades of root growth, was what one 1880s agricultural bulletin called the toughest natural material available to the homesteader. A sod cutter, which she borrowed from the land office for $1, cut strips roughly 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, and 36 inches long. Each brick weighed between 40 and 55 pounds. She cut them with the bluestem roots intact, because the root system was the structural element, the thing that held the brick together through wetting and drying cycles, through freeze and thaw, through the inevitable settling that every sod wall underwent in its first year. You cut sod with the roots, or you cut crumbling dirt that fell apart before you could stack it. She stacked them in rows to dry for a week before using them, the same way her grandfather had dried the Norwegian turf, standing them on edge so air could reach both faces and rotating them after 3 days. Wet sod, laid fresh from the ground, would shrink and crack as it dried in the wall, but partially dried brick shrank far less, and it was an extra week of work before building could begin. She did it without hesitation because she had watched her grandfather do it, and she had seen the walls he built. Working 4 to 6 hours a day, she was 61 years old, with a repaired left knee that ached on cold mornings. She cut 300 bricks in the first 2 weeks. The neighbours who passed on the road saw a small elderly woman cutting sod alone on a creek bank and assumed she was clearing ground. It did not occur to most of them that she was manufacturing building material. Per Strum's wife stopped her wagon once and asked what she was growing there, and when Ingeborg explained she was building a house, the woman said she was welcome to sleep on their floor until something proper could be arranged. Ingeborg thanked her and went back to cutting. 300 bricks was not enough. She cut 300 more in the next 2 weeks, working through a spell of warm rain that softened the ground and made the cutting easier but made the drying slower. She stacked these under a lean-to of brush she had made from willow poles to keep the worst of the rain off, and by early June she had 600 bricks dried and ready and had begun the excavation. She dug the floor of the house 4 feet below grade, below the frost line, for an ordinary year, close enough to the deep soil temperature to gain the full buffering advantage of the ground. She used a flat spade and a pickaxe she had bought used for 30 cents. The clay subsoil of the creek bank was hard and dense and came out in angular chunks that she piled to the side. The excavation took 10 days. It was 16 feet wide by 20 feet into the bank, which was as far as she could go before the bank itself became too shallow to roof easily, because at 20 feet back the bank was only 3 feet above the floor, which was not enough ceiling height. She stopped there and set her back wall. The back wall and the 2 side walls were the natural bank itself. Trimmed square with the flat spade and tamped smooth, this is what she had seen in Voss, that you do not build a back wall if the hillside can be your back wall, because the hillside is already 4, 5, 6 feet of packed earth that you could not buy for any price in Dakota Territory. The front wall, the south-facing wall that would contain the door and the 2 windows, was where the sod bricks went. She laid them the same way her grandfather had laid Norwegian turf, with the grass side facing out on the bottom course and grass side facing in on every alternate course, the root mat creating a continuous web throughout the wall thickness. Standard sod wall construction ran the bricks in 2 parallel rows, each row 12 inches wide, staggered at the joints, giving a total wall thickness of 24 inches. Some builders used a single row of bricks laid widthwise, which gave the same 24-inch thickness, but was structurally weaker because the joints ran continuously across the wall face. Ingeborg used the double row method because she had seen it hold. Each course was set with the flat faces touching and joints offset from the course below by 18 inches, exactly the same way a mason lays brick, and for exactly the same reason. A wall with continuous vertical joints is a wall with structural cracks waiting to open, while offset joints mean the weight distributes laterally and a settling crack in one brick is arrested by the sound brick alongside it. By the end of June, the front wall stood 6 feet high and the door opening was framed with rough lumber that Christopher had agreed to bring on his next visit. She had left the 2 window openings, at the planned dimensions 18 inches wide, 12 inches tall, set at a height of 4 feet from the floor, south-facing, angled slightly upward into the wall to maximize the low winter sun angle. A settler named Hans Knutsen rode past on a Thursday afternoon in late June and stopped to look. He was a practical man, 32, who had built a decent frame house the previous year and considered himself knowledgeable about construction. "Your windows are too small," he said. "For summer, yes," she said. "For winter, no." He did not understand that. She did not explain it. She went back to laying brick. The Nebraska State Historical Society's accounts of frontier sod construction, compiled from settler memoirs, describe this process in detail. The standard method was to cut into the hillside first, creating a level floor space, then build the front wall and side walls from sod bricks, using the natural hill as the back wall. The roof was the most important decision. because a standard flat sod roof brush and poles topped with 2 courses of sod would leak in every rain and risk collapse under wet snow. Ingeborg had seen that failure at home in Norway, and she did not build a flat roof. The ridge pole was a cedar log, 8 inches in diameter, that Christopher hauled out from De Smet when he finally came to see what his mother was doing. He arrived expecting to find a crude hole in a bank, and found instead a structure 16 feet wide, 20 feet deep into the hillside, with walls 2 feet thick of coursed sod on the south and west faces, the natural clay bank as the north and east walls, a packed clay floor, and a ceiling height of 7 feet at the ridge. She had spent 3 weeks asking questions at the land office and among the older Norwegian settlers about what the winters were actually like, and she had adjusted everything she knew from Voss for the Dakota scale. Christopher looked at it for a long time. "More," he said. "Mother, people are going to say things." "Let them say things," she said. He brought the cedar log, and also a second load of rough lumber for the door frame and 2 small window frames, both positioned on the south wall to catch winter sun, and he nailed them in himself, working alongside her for 4 days. Then he went back to his cattle and his own worries and left her to finish. The roof went on in layers. First, the ridge pole, propped at each end by forked posts, Ingeborg cut from ash she found along the creek. Then rafters of cottonwood spaced 18 inches apart, running from ridge to wall plate. Then a layer of wild grass she cut herself with Eric's old scythe and raked flat over the rafters. Then a first course of sod grass side down laid across the grass underlayment, then a second course offset from the first like brick courses with the grass side up. Total sod thickness on the roof was 8 inches, and the total weight per square foot of that roof ran between 15 and 20 pounds. Based on the documented construction weights in the Nebraska State Historical Society records, the pitch was deliberate. A flat sod roof on the Dakota Plains was an eventual collapse rain over snow events, where rain falls on an existing snowpack and the combined weight of wet snow and saturated sod can reach 30 pounds per square foot, had already taken several claim shanty roofs in the territory, and the NSHS records a case in Custer County in 1877 where a sod roof failed after a spring rain. The weight load is simply not sustainable on flat poles. Ingeborg's pitch, roughly 4 inches of rise per, 12 inches of run, a shallow but real slope, meant the worst of any snow accumulation would slide to the sides, where it would build into drifts against the east and west walls rather than loading the roof itself. Those drifts against the earth walls added another layer of insulation, so that the worse the blizzard, the more snow piled against the house, and the more insulated it became. She had not designed this consciously as a snow capture system. She had designed it as a roof that would not fall on her. The snow behavior was a byproduct, and she noticed it with satisfaction the first time a November storm left drifts 3 feet high against the east wall. The roof sagged slightly at the center by August, and she cut 2 more interior support posts from ash and set them under the ridge pole, which stopped the sag. On a hot August afternoon, she chinked every visible gap in the front wall with a mixture of clay and water she mixed to the consistency of thick porridge, pressing it deep into every joint with her fingers. She found 4 gaps on the south face where wind could potentially enter, 2 small separations where the top course met the door frame lumber, and she filled them all with a mix of clay and dry grass, then went around the entire interior and pressed clay into every place where the natural bank wall met the floor. She spent 2 full days on this work. Hans Knutsen rode past again in September and saw the finished house for the first time, the low sod mound, the planked door, the 2 small windows. "Is that it?" he said. "That's it," Ingeborg said. He thought about it. "It looks like a burial mound," he said. Not cruelly, just honestly, like something you'd bury grain in. "In Norway," she said, "they bury grain in something very like this. The grain keeps all winter." "You're not grain," he said. "No," she said, "but the principle is the same." He rode off without answering. She went back inside. Gunnar Solverson came by in late August when he was riding fence line and saw the finished structure for the first time. He sat on his horse for a while. You could see the house if you knew where to look as a slight hump in the creek bank, a low grass-covered mound with a planked door in the south-facing earth wall and 2 small windows on either side, a stovepipe emerging from the roof at an angle, and a woodpile stacked tight against the east side wall. "Dirt pile," he said to Per Strom, who was riding with him, not meanly, just describing what he saw. She built herself a dirt pile. The phrase stuck. By September, most of the Norwegian and German settlers within 2 miles knew Ingeborg Halse as the old woman in the dirt pile. She heard about it from Christopher. "Good," she said. "Let them call it what they want." The stove inside was a second-hand parlor stove, not a cook stove, bought for $2.75 from a family that had given up their claim and gone back east. The firebox held perhaps 8 pounds of wood, and it was not, in the opinion of anyone who saw it, adequate for a Dakota winter. Hans Knutsen, when he heard about it, said it was the size of a camp stove for a man camping one night. He had a full-size iron cook stove, and so did Solverson, and so did every settler in the area who had arrived with any preparation at all. Ingeborg did not disagree that the stove was small. She had bought it small on purpose. A large stove in a poorly insulated house burns through wood at a rate proportional to how cold the house is, which is a function of how thin the walls are and how big the temperature difference is between inside and outside. If the walls are thick enough and the house is earth-sheltered enough, the temperature difference the walls have to fight is small, and a small stove can hold the interior warm. The parlour stove she bought could produce roughly 15,000 to 18,000 British thermal units per hour when burning well. And in her earth-sheltered house, with the effective temperature difference held at 15 to 20 degrees rather than 100, that was more than enough. She also began collecting fuel in September, when the weather was still warm enough to work comfortably. She cut cottonwood and ash from the creek bottom, not the good long logs that a man with a crosscut saw would cut, but small diameter branches, the 2-inch and 3-inch growth that she could handle alone, cut into 12-inch lengths with Eric's hand axe and stacked against the east wall of the house. She collected 3/4 of a cord by the end of September. Then she learned about hay twisting from Maren Pedersen, Lars's wife, who had come through 2 hard winters already and was matter-of-fact about it. You grab a double handful of dry blue-stem grass. You twist it in one direction until it coils on itself. Then you fold it back and tuck the tail through the loop it makes. Maren could make one in 20 seconds. It took Ingeborg 2 minutes each for the first 140 seconds each by the end of October. Each bundle burned for 8 to 12 minutes in a controlled burn, enough to maintain temperature in a well-insulated space without touching the wood supply. She made 400 bundles in October and 300 more in the first week of November, before the snow got deep enough to bury the standing grass. Stacked in the corner, they rose waist-high. Gunnar Solverson saw the hay bundles when he stopped by in October to look at the stovepipe, which he had heard was improperly angled and a fire risk. He looked at the angle, it was fine, and he looked at the hay bundles. "You're burning hay?" he said. "When the wood runs low," she said. "That's not enough fuel for January," he said, not unkindly, and he genuinely believed it. He had a stove that needed 40 pounds of hardwood per day in deep cold. She had a stove that needed 12. Neither of them knew the other's number, and the difference between those 2 numbers was the difference between the winter going fine and the winter going badly. "We'll see what January says." Ingeborg told him. The coal order never came. The railroad cuts along the route to De Smet began filling with snow in late November 1880. The first serious blizzard struck October 15th, the one that dropped 60 degrees in a single day and left drifts across the rail lines that the snowplows could barely keep up with. A second storm in November buried the cuts again faster than they could be cleared. By December, trains were running sporadically, sometimes not at all for a week at a time. By January 1881, Doane Robinson's History of South Dakota records, the railroad had effectively ceased service to the furthest western points, including De Smet, and the blockade lasted until late April or early May 1881. Nobody in Kingsbury County had planned for a 6-month supply cutoff. When the last train came through in early January, the De Smet General Store had flour, kerosene, salt pork, and coal, enough for perhaps 6 weeks of normal community consumption. It was gone in 4 days. Settlers who came in from outlying claims in the 3rd week of January found bare shelves, and a storekeeper who said, with genuine apology, that there was nothing left to sell. Doane Robinson's account of this period across Dakota Territory settlements describes scenes that are almost difficult to believe. From a distance of 145 years, families burning fence posts for heat and losing the ability to keep their livestock penned as a consequence, families grinding the last of their wheat through coffee mills, not flour mills, not grist mills, but the small hand grinders meant for kitchen use to make a coarse, scratchy graham flour, because there was no other way to turn raw wheat into something edible. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was in De Smet that winter at age 13, described it in The Long Winter in 1940, and the Pioneer Girl Project's historical verification confirms the basic facts. The wheat grinding was real, the supply blockade was real, and the fuel shortage was real. Gunnar Solverson burned through his first cord of hardwood by December 20th. He told Per Strum about it, but he wasn't alarmed yet, because the coal train was still supposed to come, was just delayed, would surely be through by the new year, and he started on his 2nd cord. He rationed. He let the stove go low at night and piled every blanket in the house on the beds. He told his wife Astrid it was temporary. He told her that in December, and he was right, and he told her that in January, and he was less certain. By the middle of January, with the stove going low at night and the house temperature dropping to the mid-30s after midnight, his youngest child, a boy of 7, developed a cough that would not clear. Solverson's Queen Acme stove, excellent as it was, could not change the physics of his house. The walls were 1-inch pine planks with tar paper outside, and on a -30 night every square foot of those walls was bleeding heat to the outside, at a rate the stove could barely keep pace with when it was burning full. When he rationed the fuel and let it burn low, the house simply became cold. The stove wasn't the problem. The walls were the problem, and he could have had 3 Queen Acme stoves and the problem would have been the same, just burning through fuel 3 times faster. Hans Knutsen's frame house went cold in late January. He brought his family to the Strum house, and Per Strum, who had a somewhat better-built frame house with an additional layer of tar paper on the north wall, found himself heating for 4 extra people on a wood supply meant for 2. His wife began making hay bundles, the way Maren had shown Ingeborg in October, and they burned through those in 2 weeks. Ingeborg, meanwhile, was doing none of those things. Her house was warm because it cost almost nothing to keep warm. She burned an average of 2 small fires per day through December and January, morning and evening, each lasting 2 to 3 hours on a modest load of cottonwood or a cluster of hay bundles, and on the coldest nights she kept a slow fire going from midnight until 4 in the morning, then let it die and slept under her wool blankets in a house that held its temperature far longer than any frame structure could. She crossed the county road once in January to check on Per Strum's father-in-law, who was alone and whom she had agreed to look in on. She found him alive and cold and grateful and brought him back to her house for the duration. By late January, Solverson was burning fence rails. His house temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit at night. His water barrel froze solid. He went to the general store in De Smet and found a line of settlers all doing the same, buying what little fuel remained at prices that had doubled, then tripled, then gone off the shelf entirely. He rode past Ingeborg's mound of a house on his way back. Smoke was rising from her stovepipe in a thin, steady line. Not panicked smoke, not a roaring fire, but a small, managed fire. He stopped his horse. He sat there for a moment. He had 200 pounds of flour left and no heat to cook it with. He knocked on the door. She opened it, and the air that came out was noticeably warm, not hot, not luxurious, but real warmth. He could smell it from the porch. Earth, hay, dried grass, the faint sweetness of cottonwood smoke. "How much wood do you have?" he asked. She thought about it. "Enough until April," she said. He looked at her. She was not gloating. She was 61 years old, with a bad knee and a second-hand stove, and she had built something that worked when nothing else on the county road was working. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "I might need to ask." "When you need to ask, come back," she said. He nodded and rode home. The winter of 1880-81 hardened in January and stayed hard. The Bismarck Signal Corps recorded temperatures of -29 degrees Fahrenheit at Fort Lincoln in early January. The newspaper in Yankton reported that settlers who burned fence posts to stay warm had lost their ability to keep livestock penned, and animals froze in collapsed or open enclosures. Doane Robinson's account mentions community groups forming in De Smet and other towns, rotating between houses to share heat and grinding their last wheat through coffee mills to make coarse flour because no commercial flour could come through. The ground froze deep. In years with heavy snowpack, the drifts actually insulate the ground below, but 1880-81 combined heavy snow with extreme cold, and contemporaneous accounts describe water wells freezing at shallow depths. The standard root cellar at 3 feet of depth, the depth most settlers had dug, failed in many cases, and the Nebraska farmer would later report that families relying on 3-foot cellars lost their potato stores completely, while only those who had dug 6 feet or deeper kept food unfrozen. Ingeborg had dug her main food storage into the back of the hillside at the full depth of the bank, roughly 5 to 6 feet below grade. Her potato supply, her salt pork, and her barrel of pickled cabbage were all intact in March, when other families were eating boiled leather straps. She did not advertise this. Christopher came out from De Smet in late February with his family, his wife Signe, and their 2 children, because their claimed shanty near Huron had become genuinely unlivable. The temperature inside the shanty on cold nights was dropping to 20 degrees, and his youngest, a girl of 4, had a persistent cough that worsened every night. He drove the 4-hour sled route through snowdrifts and arrived at his mother's door at dusk. She had the parlor stove going. The interior was 58 degrees cool, but not dangerous. She had food and 3 hay bundle fires left for the evening, and enough cottonwood for another week. Christopher looked around the interior, the packed clay floor, the 2 small windows catching the last afternoon sun, the sod walls dark and dense, the neat stacks of twisted hay, and said, "More, how did you know?" "I didn't know," she said. "I just remembered." She remembered a stone and sod farmhouse outside Voss, built by her grandfather's grandfather, that had stood for 160 years against Norwegian winters. She remembered that the families in those old hillside houses had never once spoken of a winter that killed them. They complained about other things, illness, crop failure, floods, but not cold. The cold they had solved 4 generations back by putting a grass-covered roof over a hole in a hill. The physics had not changed between Voss in 1720 and Kingsbury County in 1881. The grass was different, the hillside was different, the temperature swings were more extreme, But the principle reduced the temperature difference. Your walls have to fight by surrounding them with earth instead of air was identical. By March, Gunnar Solverson had exhausted everything that would burn on his property. He had pulled planks from an outbuilding and burned a wagon wheel, and he had 2 children and a wife, and a house that would not hold heat no matter how much fuel he put into it, because the physics of that house were wrong from the foundation up. He came to Ingeborg's door with his hat in his hand. She had 6 people in the house by then herself: Christopher, Signe, the 2 grandchildren, and Per Strom's elderly father-in-law, whom she had brought back in January. She had twisted hay stacked along the entire inside of the east wall and 2 small fires running in rotation, one in the stove and one in the iron pot on the floor near the back. The temperature was holding at 52 degrees on the coldest nights, cool enough that you kept your wool vest on, warm enough that the children were not shivering. Solverson stood in the doorway with Astrid and their 2 children behind him. He looked at the interior, the packed clay floor worn smooth from months of foot traffic, the sod walls 2 feet thick and dark, with the dampness of the bank behind them, and absolutely still with no draught and no cold air seeping through, the ceiling 7 feet high at the ridge, with the cottonwood rafters showing between the grass and sod above, and the small south-facing windows letting in the low January light that fell across the floor in a pale stripe every clear afternoon, and left the clay warm to the touch for hours afterward. He looked at the twisted hay bundles stacked to the ceiling in the east corner. "How much of that is left?" he asked. "Enough for 3 more weeks," she said. "Maybe 4 if the weather lifts." She stepped aside. He brought his family in. They spent 3 weeks in that hillside, all 9 of them in a space 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep. It was not comfortable. There was not enough room to move without stepping around someone. The children slept on the floor on a pallet of dry grass that Christopher had cut from under a south-facing drift, and the adults slept in shifts. Astrid Solverson, who had not exchanged more than polite greetings with Ingeborg before the winter, learned to twist hay bundles in the first week and was making them as fast as Ingeborg by the second. Gunnar said very little about the house while he was in it. He organised the fuel rotation, fixed the east window frame that had warped slightly with the moisture, and went out in the worst cold, -35, -40, to check the snow loading on the roof and pack the drifts back from the stovepipe opening when they threatened to block it. He was not a bad man. He had been wrong about one thing, one very important thing, and he was living inside the consequences of that mistake, alongside the woman he had called the dirt pile lady, and he never used that phrase again, not that winter, not after. One afternoon in late February, when the temperature outside was -28 and the interior of the house held at 50 degrees, Solverson sat near the stove and watched the thin stripe of afternoon sun move across the clay floor. He watched it for a long time. "The floor is warmer where the sun hits," he said finally. "Yes," Ingeborg said. She did not explain it. She let him sit with it. "How long does it stay warm after the sun goes?" 4 hours, on a clear day, sometimes 5. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I put my windows on the north and the east." "I saw that," she said. He didn't say anything after that, but she knew he was thinking about next year's construction, and she was right. When the first train broke through to De Smet in late April 1881, Solverson was among the settlers at the depot. He bought lumber and a second stove, but he could not afford to tear down the frame house because his cash was nearly gone and the lumber had cost more than he had expected. That summer, over 6 weeks of weekend work, he dug a root cellar behind the house, not 3 feet, but 6. He cut sod bricks the way he had watched Ingeborg do it, drying them on edge before stacking, and he built the cellar walls, 18 inches thick, with a pitched sod roof using cedar rafters that Ingeborg suggested he get from the creek bottom rather than buy at the lumber yard. The cellar went in south-facing, which was not the most convenient location relative to his house, but was where the bank ran the right direction. And he connected it to the kitchen with a short covered passage, a wood-frame tunnel, nothing more, but enough to make the trip for firewood or stored food without going fully outside in a blizzard. It looked, if you squinted, exactly like what Ingeborg would have built. She came by to see it in September, 2 weeks before the first snow. She walked around it and pressed on the walls and checked the roof pitch and looked at the south-facing door opening. "The joints need chinking," she said, pointing to 3 gaps near the top of the east wall where the sod bricks had not seated fully against each other. He chinked them that afternoon with a clay and water mixture she showed him how to prepare, and she came back 2 days later and checked the gaps again. They had held. "Good," she said, and walked home. He stood looking at the cellar after she left. He had 2 cords of hardwood already cut and stacked inside it, protected from the weather, along with his potato crop, 3 barrels of salt pork, and a barrel of pickled cabbage. The same stores Ingeborg had put by the year before, after she told him what she had eaten through the worst of the long winter. He had a coal order coming on the October train. The coal order came that fall. The train ran all winter. The winter of 1881-82 was unremarkable cold, as Dakota winters always were, but nothing like the siege of the year before. Solverson burned through 2 cords of hardwood, which was what he had planned for, and he did not need the cellar's full storage capacity. But the cellar was there. Let us stop here and be precise about what the physics actually were, because the story only makes sense if you understand what Ingeborg was doing and why it worked. Soil at depth does not behave like air. Air is thin and mobile. It cannot hold much heat. It moves constantly, and when cold air replaces warm air, the heat is simply gone. Soil is dense, still, and slow. Its thermal properties are called thermal mass, the ability of a dense material to absorb, store, and gradually release heat. The specific heat capacity of typical prairie soil, clay, and loam is roughly 0.2 to 0.3 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit, and a cubic foot of that soil weighs roughly 90 to 110 pounds. A house surrounded by 2 feet of soil on all 4 sides, and the ceiling has an enormous thermal buffer, not creating heat, but damping out temperature swings. On the day of the first real cold snap in late October 1880, when the temperature fell from 41 degrees Fahrenheit to below 0 in a few hours, Ingeborg's interior temperature dropped 3 degrees. Solverson's frame house dropped 22 degrees in the same period, according to his own account recorded in a land office deposition the following spring. The south-facing windows were not incidental. At the latitude of Kingsbury County, South Dakota, roughly 44 degrees north, the winter sun rides low in the sky, angling across the horizon at a shallow pitch. A south-facing window in January catches that low-angle sun and directs it onto the interior floor and back wall of the house. The floor was packed clay, and clay has a heat capacity of roughly 25 British thermal units per cubic foot per degree. Not extraordinary, but real. Every hour of winter sun that came through those 2 small windows was heating 60 or 80 pounds of clay floor, storing a few hundred BTU that would release slowly through the afternoon and evening. Ingeborg had not calculated any of this, and had not heard the term thermal mass in her life. But she had watched her grandfather's house for decades, and she had observed that the rooms with south-facing windows were always the warmest, and that the warmth lasted long after the sun went down, and that the rock and clay floors held their temperature long after a fire went out. She had observed enough over enough winters to replicate the pattern. That is the other thing this story is about. Knowledge that exists in practice before it exists in theory. The settlers around Ingeborg had access to better materials, better tools, better cash, and better social standing. What they did not have was 61 years of watching a specific type of house perform in extreme cold. And, The willingness, the necessity to build what she had seen work rather than what the land office pamphlets recommended. The winter of 1880-81 ended, in the accounting of meteorologist Barbara Mays Bowstead, with the most extreme, sustained cold anomaly on record at the Omaha and Dodge City weather stations. De Smet received blizzards on approximately 47 of 59 days between January and February 1881 alone. The Missouri River flooded catastrophically in April when everything melted at once, 132 buildings destroyed in Vermilion, most of Yankton. The railroad reached De Smet in late April and early May. Ingeborg Halse had used approximately 3/4 of a cord of cottonwood, the equivalent of several hundred twisted hay bundles, and a quantity of dried buffalo chips collected before the first snow. Her food storage was intact. Her house had not leaked the pitched sod roof with its double course of sod bricks offset like tiles, had shed the snow and the January rain over snow events without the catastrophic leaking that flat-roofed soddies experienced. She proved up her homestead claim in 1885 and lived in the Kingsbury County hillside house until 1891, when she moved to De Smet to be near Christopher's family. The house was subsequently used as a root cellar and outbuilding by the family that bought the quarter section, and in that use as pure underground storage it served for another 20 years. No record exists of anyone calling it a dirt pile after the winter of 1880-81. There is a detail from Solverson's land office deposition, filed in April 1881 as part of a claim for relief compensation from the Dakota Territory government, that deserves to stand on its own. He was asked to describe the conditions in his house during the worst of the winter, and he wrote, "From January 8th to February 14th, I was unable to keep my house above 32 degrees Fahrenheit at night, on account of insufficient fuel. My wife and children slept in their coats. We were not in danger of our lives, but we were in danger of losing the children to sickness from prolonged cold exposure." He was then asked whether any neighbour had remained adequately heated, and he wrote, "The old Norwegian woman, Mrs. Halse, whose house is dug into the creek bank 1/4 mile south of my property, was at all times adequately heated and had sufficient food stores. She sheltered myself and my family for 3 weeks in February and March. Her house is built from the hillside and covered with sod on the roof and the front wall. The interior temperature, even during the worst of the cold, was tolerable. That word tolerable is doing a lot of work. For a man whose children had been sleeping in their coats for 5 weeks, tolerable was exactly the right word." A standard claim shanty or frame house on the open Dakota plains in 1880 was fighting the cold with resistance alone. Thin walls trying to hold back an enormous temperature difference, with the wind stripping away any heat that leaked through every gap and crack. Wind made a house colder faster, and settlers understood this physically even if they never put the mechanism into words. A well-chinked sod wall shed wind completely. You could put your hand against the interior of Ingeborg's south wall in a 40-mile-an-hour blizzard and feel no cold current. The wall was 2 feet of compressed grass and clay roots, and it was not moving. The roof, 8 inches of sod on poles and brush, was the weakest point, and Ingeborg had pitched it deliberately, at roughly a 4-in-12 slope, so that snow would shed to the sides rather than accumulate. The weight of wet sod roofs was what caused collapses. A flat sod roof under a rain-over-snow event could add another 5 to 8 pounds per square foot, pushing the structure past what the poles could hold. Ingeborg's roof did not collapse. Several flat-roofed soddies in the county did, though fortunately in none of those cases were the occupants inside. The second critical decision was the depth of food storage. She had dug the back corner of her house, the part deepest into the hillside, an additional 2 feet below floor level. A wooden hatch covered it. Everything that could freeze potatoes, cabbage, the salt pork went in there. At 6 feet below grade, the temperature stayed above freezing all winter. The families who lost their food stores in 1880-81 were the ones who had root cellars at 3 feet, which the extraordinary cold penetrated. Ingeborg's deeper storage was intact. The third decision, and the one that sounds simplest but cost the most labor, was the fuel preparation. She had spent every dry day in October and early November collecting and cutting and twisting, not because she had predicted the blockade, but because she had grown up in a house where the winter fuel supply was considered as important as the harvest, and where you did not wait for signs of trouble before you started working. She had 6 weeks of harvest-equivalent effort invested in fuel before the first serious snow fell. The schoolchildren's blizzard of January 12th, 1888, arrived 8 years after the long winter, a different event entirely, but instructive in the same way, for the same reasons. The morning of January 12th, the temperature in Huron, Dakota Territory, was in the 40s Fahrenheit. Children walked to school in light jackets. Teachers let their stoves go low. Then, just before noon, a cold front struck the northern plains with a speed that no one who had not witnessed it could quite believe. The temperature fell 18 degrees in 3 minutes at each point the front crossed. At Huron, the Signal Corps recorded the temperature falling from the high 30s to -17 by 10 that evening. Winds drove fine snow dry as flour, invisible until it was on you at 45 miles per hour. At least 235 people died, and many estimates run to 500 when counting those who died later from frostbite complications. Most of them froze within a quarter-mile of shelter. The pattern that holds across both 1880-81 and January 12th, 1888, is the same one. The people who survived in buildings were the ones in buildings that held heat when the fire was marginal or gone. Lizzie Hardy kept 31 students in her schoolhouse near Clarkson, Nebraska, through the night of January 12th. Not a sod schoolhouse, not an earth house, just a building with enough fuel, and a teacher who refused to move, and all 31 survived. Kate Campen, in Marion, Dakota Territory, survived in her sod house with her 4-day-old infant, keeping them both warm in bed while the storm screamed outside. Minnie Freeman's sod school near Ord, Nebraska, the most famous story from that night is the one where the roof blew off. The tar paper and sod roof, improperly anchored, lost its upper courses to the wind, and Freeman led her 13 students through the whiteout to a farmhouse half a mile away, tied together with twine, and they all survived. But the story is often misread. The sod walls held. What failed was a poorly constructed roof, not the principle but the execution. The principle held in 1880, and it held in 1888, and it holds today. The U.S. Department of Energy, in its current guidance on earth-sheltered homes, notes that properly constructed earth-sheltered structures in the northern Great Plains, the same geography where Ingeborg Halse filed her Homestead claim in 1880 show heating, cost reductions of 50 to 80% compared to conventional above-grade construction, primarily because the soil surrounding the walls holds a stable temperature far above the winter air temperature, reducing the effective heat loss through those walls by the same factor that Ingeborg was unconsciously calculating when she chose her south-facing creek bank. The American Solar Energy Society's documented measurements on a modern earth-sheltered home in a northern climate showed total heat loss of roughly 1,100 British thermal units per square foot per day, compared to roughly 20,000 British thermal units per square foot per day for a comparable conventional structure, an 18-to-1 ratio in favor of the earth-sheltered building. The designers who published the first systematic research on this in the 1970s, during the energy crisis, described it as a rediscovery. The builders who put up soddy houses on the northern plains in the 1870s and 1880s were practicing versions of the same principle, with varying success depending on how deeply they understood what they were doing, and the families who dug fully into hillsides who made the effort to go deeper, to pitch the roof, to orient the windows south, to insulate with the mass of the earth rather than trying to fight through it, were the ones whose houses worked. Ingeborg Halse understood this because she had grown up with houses that worked. The settlers around her were building what the land office pamphlets showed, what the lumber yards sold, what looked like permanence. She was building what she had seen last through a winter she would actually survive. Here is where it ends, in the spring of 1881, when Gunnar Solverson came back one last time before the railroad opened. He brought her a load of dry cottonwood he had found a stand along a creek 2 miles east, protected from the worst drifts, with sections that had fallen and dried over the summer, and he unloaded it himself and stacked it against her east wall without being asked. She watched from the door. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He stacked for a while without talking. Then he said, "How thick were the sod bricks on the roof?" 4 inches per course, she said. 2 courses, offset. 8 inches total. He nodded. He was thinking about the outbuilding he was planning to replace. She watched him work and said nothing else about it because there was nothing else to say. The winter had done the explaining. She had only to stand in her doorway, in a house that had held heat while his had not, and let him ask the questions he needed to ask. He asked 3 more questions about the roof pitch and the rafter spacing before he finished stacking, and she answered all of them. What Ingeborg Halse built in 1880 was not unusual by the standards of 400 years of Norwegian turf house construction, or by the standards of the Mandan and Hidatsa earth lodges that had been keeping people warm on the northern plains since before European contact. It was unusual by the standards of white settlement in Dakota Territory in 1880, where the aspiration was to build what the people back in Ohio or Wisconsin had built: wood frames, board siding, iron stoves as fast as possible, as a signal that you had arrived and were going to stay. The aspiration was understandable. The physics were unforgiving. The settlers who built what they knew from home from climates that were not Kingsbury County in January, from places where a thin-walled house might lose heat faster than a good stove could replace it, but where the difference was survivable, those settlers made it through average winters because their wood piles held out. The winter of 1880-81 was not average, and the schoolchildren's blizzard of 1888 was not average. The average winters could be survived in a thin-walled house with a big stove. The outlier winters found the weakness in every design and killed through it. Ingeborg's design had no weakness that the winter could find. The walls were too thick to chink. The roof shed snow and rain. The food was too deep to freeze. The fuel requirement was small enough that what she had gathered by November was enough to reach April. The windows let in what sun there was, and the floor held what warmth the sun had given. She did not survive the winter of 1880-81 because she was tougher than Gunnar Solverson. She was 61 years old with a repaired knee, and he was 38 and in good health. She survived it because the structure she built was better at the specific job that a Dakota winter demanded, keeping a modest fire's heat inside against a cold that lasted 6 months and cut off every supply line. That is not a story about character. It is a story about physics, about the difference between a wall that fights a 105-degree temperature gap and a wall that fights a 15-degree temperature gap, about the difference between a 2-foot sod wall and a 1-inch plank, about the difference between 45 degrees in the ground and minus 45 degrees in the air. The woman who understood those differences was laughed at in September and sheltering families in February. The U.S. Department of Energy identifies earth-sheltered construction as one of the most cost-effective approaches to extreme climate building in the northern Great Plains. The same geography, the same latitudes, the same temperature swings that Ingeborg Halse was dealing with in 1880. Modern passive house design is built on the same principle she was using. Reduce the temperature difference your walls have to fight, and you reduce everything else: fuel cost, risk of failure, vulnerability to supply disruption. What the engineers who wrote the 1970s earth shelter studies found measuring monitored buildings, comparing fuel bills, running heat loss calculations, was that the northern Great Plains region Ingeborg homesteaded in is one of the places where earth-sheltered construction shows its largest advantage. The bigger the gap between winter air temperature and summer air temperature, the more the stable ground temperature at depth helps. In a mild coastal climate, the ground is only modestly better than the air. In Dakota Territory, where air temperatures swing from -40 to +100 across the year, the ground at depth is dramatically more stable than the air above it, and the advantage is proportional to the extremity of the climate. The worst climates for above-grade construction are the best climates for earth-sheltered construction. Ingeborg built in the worst possible above-grade climate, using the technique that turned that climate into an asset. She did not choose it for that reason, she chose it because it was what she knew. But the choice and the reasoning align perfectly, which is what happens when a practice has been refined over 4 centuries of cold-weather building. The woman in the dirt pile was ahead of the building codes by roughly a century. She did not know that, she just knew her house was warm. And in the winter of 1880-81 in Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, warm was the only argument that mattered. Nobody was laughing at the dirt pile by February. Nobody called it that again, when the snow was still on the ground in April, and the trains were still not running, and the only house on the county road with enough heat left to shelter 9 people was the low grass-covered mound by the creek, the one an old Norwegian woman had built alone, with a borrowed sod cutter and a hand axe, and 61 years of watching the right kind of house get through a hard winter.